Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 456, and it's August 31st, 1980. I'm going to continue this hour. I'd like to do about 10 more hours on Ronald Reagan. Maybe I'll write a short book or an article about Ronald Reagan, but I want to continue where I left off, the milieu of Reagan as governor of California, in order to understand the forces behind him, the power behind him. The true story of the violence in California alone has never really been put together and identified as the FBI counterintelligence operation that it really was, the Operation Chaos that the CIA and Pentagon had instrumented out here in California that followed around the country. Last week I was talking about a book by Bill Turner, The Power on the Right. He was an ex-FBI man who I said had left the FBI because of the black bag jobs and the burglaries, and he disagreed with J. Edgar Hoover, and he became a researcher at the time of the Kennedy assassination. He was a writer for Ramparts magazine. He's written a book on the police establishment. He went to New Orleans to help Jim Garrison with his investigation into the Kennedy assassination. And I want to just give a few direct quotes from the book, The Power on the Right, because of its relationship not only to the Kennedy murders, but to the future politicians that are behind and were behind Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. He wrote in his book, it was not until the assassination of John Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963, that the political center of gravity of the nation as a whole began a perceptible shift to the right. That was 17 years ago when I began my research and when Charles Spears began his research in Texas 17 years ago. Bill Turner wrote, the wealthy Texans who helped shape and advance Lyndon Johnson's career were men like George and Herman Brown from Brown Root Construction Company that went on to build the bases in Vietnam and later over in Iran. Clint Murchison Sr. and H.L. Hunt hardly subscribed to the liberal ethic, and they were behind their protege, Lyndon Johnson. He wrote, the escalation of the war in Vietnam in 1964 and 65 renewed the anti-communism, and the cries of the Korean War and the reactionary forces were ready to take hold as soon as John Kennedy was assassinated. He added that one of the great ironies at our time was that as Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were murdered in 1968, the far right and the law and order people came in even stronger. The lifestyles and the subcultures clashed with each other. There were riots. Martin Luther King was against violence, and because he was nonviolent like Mahatma Gandhi and was murdered, the violences stirred around the city and were the excuse for more law and order instead of more understanding. The direct quotation of Revillo Oliver that I mentioned last week in American Opinion, that he gave at a speech working for Robert Welch and the Birch Society, was in 1966 at a meeting of God, Family, and Country rally. He said the vaporizing of the Jews was a beatific vision. Family, God, Family, and Country is the symbol of Paul Lasalle's campaign, again the campaign manager of Ronald Reagan, hiding under God and Family and Country. The same people that supported Salazar in Portugal or Franco in Spain, Batista in Cuba, Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, and Chiang Kai-shek in China, and so forth, are the people behind God, Family, and Country, having rallies when they're supporting dictatorships and drug dealers and criminals as heads of states all over the world. The FBI had located people involved in the Kennedy assassination, a Lauren Hall. He was in Johnsondale, it's called, in California. They found him in 1964. He was working with anti-Castro Cubans. He was in Dallas in September of 1963. He was working with a William Seymour from Arizona. These people were identified as being part of the California milieu of the Minutemen, the Nazis. They were having meetings, and as I said before, Ronald Reagan refused to extradite Edgar Eugene Bradley, who was attending those meetings, who was linked to the assassination teams that also worked out of Fort Benning, Georgia, and with the National States Rights Party in California. The link of Georgia to California with the Nazi Party, the Klan, the anti-Castro Cubans. That Billy James Hargis, the head of the Christian Crusade, had meetings, a meeting for freedom and the American Committee to Free Cuba. He had literature about the anti-communist crusade, and he was one of the very first financial advisors and angels, one of the original angels behind Ronald Reagan, and he had him elected to the Republican Party Central Committee. He was one of the people behind Reagan's campaign, and he was also named in conjunction with activities in the Kennedy assassination and was suspected assassins. Major Edgar Bundy of the Church League of America, part of the McIntyre-Hargis team, active in Atlanta, had an organization, interestingly enough, at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Bundy had attended Oglethorpe College in Atlanta, and he graduated from Wheaton College in Illinois and then was a newspaper reporter and entered the Air Force in 1941. Now, this man was active, this Major Edgar Bundy, who belonged to the Church League of America, out of Wheaton, Illinois, and went into as an intelligence officer and worked with Nationalist China's. He got a prize from Madame Claire Chennault, Major General Claire Chennault, and the Flying Tigers for his work with the Chinese, and that was, of course, linked to narcotics and the CIA during the war. This Major Edgar Bundy of the Church League of America was working in Chicago at the same time Ronald Reagan was there. Ronald Reagan moved to California in 1937, but a group was called the Chicago Crime Commission that investigated Roosevelt's court, and they didn't want too many new dealers in the courts in Chicago. And this Major Edgar Bundy of the Church League of America, a far rightist from Wheaton College, Illinois, as I say, an Air Force intelligence, was a big factor behind Ronald Reagan later. Bundy was active during the year that Reagan was running for president. The first time they wanted him, the League issued a motion picture called Ronald Reagan on the Welfare State, and they advertised the fact that he was hitting hard against state welfarism. I don't know if Major Edgar Bundy of the Church League knew Ronald Reagan in Illinois in 1937, and being in intelligence, whether he was instrumental in sending him to Hollywood, where Reagan was beginning to receive immediately $200 a week on a payroll at a studio. Bundy was active in the apartheid nations of Africa. He praised them, and this Bundy was one of the men that had these church files that I was speaking about before. He had data banks on anti-communists and so forth. An interesting career between Chicago and the church and Ronald Reagan's activities and Wheaton College in Illinois, and I'm wondering if, because he sponsored Reagan later, if he knew Ronald Reagan when he went to the Christian College in Illinois, and whether he was useful in counterintelligence going back to those early days. It certainly is important to ask the questions and then look for answers later in the background of Ronald Reagan. Patrick Frawley put up $200 million of sales money from Eversharp, Schick, and Technicolor into the anti-Christian communist crusade, the American Security Council, the Roman Catholic-oriented Twin Circle Publishing Company. Well, the very staunch conservatives in Texas were not Catholic. The California group, as I say, worked with Ronald Reagan, who was Catholic, and so was Frawley. And one of the people on Frawley's list was Governor Ronald Reagan. He supported former Senator George Murphy and Max Rafferty, and he was really big for Ronald Reagan and gave him a lot of money to start his political career. And as I said before, Patrick Frawley hired Ed Butler, who worked for him. Butler came from New Orleans. He was an Army man. He worked for the Birch Society, the White Citizens Council, the Free Voice of Latin America. He formed the American Council of the Americans, the INCA, and he worked with Dr. Ochsner down in New Orleans. That's that ultra-conservative. And he was hailed by Hale Boggs, later on the Warren Commission, and it was Ed Butler working for Frawley, as I said, who made that record, Oswald's self-portrait in red, where Oswald said, "I am a Marxist." That was a setup to be used, and it was immediately played on radio the day that John Kennedy was murdered. Frawley, according to Bill Turner, played an equally important role in the political career of Ronald Reagan. His candidacy was launched by Frawley, as well as the men from California, as I mentioned, Henry Salvatore of Western Geophysical. Now, Salvatore had a corporation that later merged into Litton Industries, and that is very important into the history of Ronald Reagan's early career. The Reagan Finance Committee, very early, was spearheaded by Salvatore, and Salvatore formed a company that later merged with Litton Industry. They raised first $1 million for Goldwater and funded the Christian anti-communist crusade. There are about 40 or 50 Christian organizations they were behind, and put their money in the public relations firm and banked upon Ronald Reagan. Their theme was Reagan's campaign, that creative society, and they pushed Ronald Reagan as their candidate. Because of the consistency that they pushed Reagan and the amount of money and power behind Reagan, I wonder about this Bundy in Illinois with connections, this Major Edgar Bundy, to the churches and the church councils, and if, in fact, he knew him in Chicago in 1937, and if Reagan was sent to California to continue, given a movie career, and to continue to be important to their political advantage. Now, Henry Ford, the Ford Motor Company, was one of the largest organizations that supplied and armed Adolf Hitler. There were others, but Ford was probably the worst, along with ITT. And Henry Ford was the gentleman who took forged documents called the Elders of the Prodigals of Zion, allegedly written by a clique of Jews that said they were intent to rule the world. The actual truth was that the power, the wealth, is in the hands of mostly Gentile corporations with a few Jews in the front, but not very many of them. Henry Ford was angry at Karl Marx. Marx was a Jew. They were angry the Tsar was thrown out, getting back to that early history again. And Henry Ford wanted a revolution in this country against all the Soviets. He wanted the American people to rise up and throw out all people in the labor movement and suspected communists. And Ford Motor Company was very active politically in Germany before the war and after the war in rebuilding Germany. And when Litton Industries was formed, Tex Thornton came to California, and they worked for the Hughes Aircraft, and then they formed Litton Industry. Tex Thornton had come from Ford Motor Company in Michigan out to California and took his buddy Roy Ash, and they took $43 million that I've mentioned many times from used contracts from our tax money and formed Litton Industry. But the important thing is that this violently anti-Semitic, pro-Hitler stance of the Ford Motor Company produced people like Tex Thornton, who came out to the Hughes organization and formed their own companies and formed Litton Industry, and Salvatore merged his company then with Litton, so that the same people that put Richard Nixon in power and Ronald Reagan were a nest of people in California linked to companies that didn't just fade away. If they were just companies by name and had no meaning, that would be one thing, but Roy Ash, under Nixon's administration, was head of Office of Management Budget and put in the military dictatorship in Greece and dictatorship in Chile. And Allende had been murdered, and the ITT and the corporations were putting Nazis with Nazi armbands and swastikas coming out in countries all over the world that the World Bank and American corporations were and are financing today. And I didn't mention last week the news in Bolivia. The government that's in power now, the narcotics dealers, the no narcotics dealers working with the United States, protected by the United States, are taking heads and putting them on sticks and parading down the streets and torturing hundreds of people, this new military dictatorship. That was an act that the Ustashi, the Croatians, did in Yugoslavia, and Hitler claimed that they were more Nazi than he liked his killings done behind the gates of concentration camps, if possible, where the world and the press wouldn't see it. This is going on in Bolivia. This is the heritage of these people. But Salvatore was behind Richard Nixon's campaign. He was behind Ronald Reagan's campaign, and he merged his company with Litton Industry, that was an offshoot of Hughes and also Hughes Aircraft, and also of Henry Ford. Henry Ford had another hand in the California pie, and this is important to understand what the space stations are about what the assassination teams are about, or how mind control and counterintelligence came, RAND Corporation was formed in California, and that became the think tank for the Pentagon, for the decision makers that worked with the Hoover Institute, whose sole goal is anti-Marxism. If it were anti-Marxism, that would be bad enough, but they're really anti-labor, and they bring in goon squads and kill labor leaders and attempt to keep down the wages of the masses in this country. And certainly there have been no leaders of great insight to free people from the cost today of education and health and housing and the necessities of life. Education, housing, and health and job opportunities are all being diminished, and the profits in the hands of the few are becoming larger. So the problems that they confronted and mapped out are working for them. And in the event that there are riots or street scenes, Richard Nixon left the heritage of his Operation Chaos, and Ronald Reagan, as governor, had his SWAT teams ready, and we'll go into some of those provisions. The SWAT teams that were formed were set up, according to headlines, in case there are food riots later in this country. Well, RAND Corporation, according to a book published by RAND on their 25th anniversary, I'm quoting, was a social invention. RAND was a meeting ground where problems and resources of science and technology came together. RAND was incorporated in May 1948 with funding from the Ford Foundation. That was May 1948. Ford Foundation, after a 2-year gestation period called Project RAND. It was a special experimental contract between the Army Air Force and Douglas Aircraft Company. The Air Force Project RAND, R-A-N-D, contract went to the RAND Corporation in May of 1948. May 48 was the year that Israel became a country, and it was the year that all the top Nazis, about 30 of them, were assembled in Egypt to meet with Anwar Sadat and the Egyptians and Nasser. The Borman Brotherhood had been formed, and the plans to wipe out Israel, surround it and control it, were being made in May of 1948, the same year that Israel became a country. The RAND book talks about in 1950 they undertook work for the Atomic Energy Commission in addition to the Air Force, and in 1959 their projects agency became part of NASA, the National Aeronautics Space Administration. So that the projects of RAND went from the inventions and ideas of Ford Motor Company out to California, because the motor car company doesn't conceive of the operations and inventions. RAND can conceive of them and suggest who gets the contracts. In their blurb of advertising in their book, they aren't advertising, but inside the book covers they have suggestions and projects of RAND that were done in the past 25 years, such as remotely manned systems in tactical area warfare, Cuba and Pearl Harbor, hindsight and foresight, Soviet expenditures on scientific research, the study of passive communications of satellites, United States policy in Middle East, constraints and choices, economics of defense in the nuclear age. Everything for war out of the Ford Motor Company that started making its tanks and cars for the United States and for Germany went into the thinking part, went out to RAND, and RAND was an extension of the Ford Motor Company, and RAND and Roy Ash, Litton Industries, and Hughes Aircraft, and Lockheed, and the aerospace industries have all profited to the tune of millions and billions of dollars of warfare money ever since the end of World War I, thanks to the think tanks that projected the necessity of continuing that war against Russia that began the day World War I was over and Germany was rearmed for that war. There's a magazine out, getting back to Ronald Reagan's personal career, a magazine called National Journal. The subscription is $450 a year, so it must be pretty good. There's an article about Ronald Reagan titled, "Ronald Reagan Plays Chairman of the Board to Carter's Corporate Controller." And there's a quotation, one of Ronald Reagan's wonderful quotations. He says, "I am a candidate of big business," he boasted to delegates, that he represents big business. And they had a journal that came out in July of this year that somebody got for me, and there is Another quotation, he went to Sacramento with the image of a movie actor and a cowboy hero. And I think in all the time he was there, a lot of people never did learn that he was a working governor. He spent a lot of time at it. Now that cowboy image is very important. It was an image that Adolf Hitler used in conquering, going after the rednecks. It was described in a book, The Eagle's Nest. There's a chapter in there I love called The Fuhrer and the Cowboys. Hitler had a secret passion for cowboys and Indians. This is interesting because of the similarity of the people that put Richard Nixon into power and Ronald Reagan into the ascendancy of the governorship, and how they did it, and what Reagan did when he was governor. There's another article that just came out. This is an essay by William Safire, Ronnie Le Cowboy. The idea of Ronald Reagan being the cowboy and dispelling the idea in Europe that he's just a chimpanzee feeding actor or a bipolar explorer. That Ronnie is an important image, not only Ronnie Le Cowboy, but that he will have responsibility for the future administration. That's what William Safire is saying, but he calls him the cowboy, and the National Journal refers to him as that image. He sits on his horse. He has a gun by his side. Esquire has an article this month on Ronald Reagan. He loves that farm and the ranch, and he rides in the sunset in the afternoons. He loves to ride his horse on the horse and play the cowboy image, and people visualize him as a Westerner on a Western ranch with his horse. As I say, the comparisons are important because this image was played by John Wayne, and there was a man in Germany named Karl Mayes, and Adolf Hitler just loved him. As I say, this book describes the Fuhrer and the cowboys, and it goes into the fact, I'll quote a few lines, Hitler had a secret passion. Fascinated by cowboys and Indians, he found the stories written by Karl May, a German who wrote about the American frontier, fascinating. Germany had sold 70 million copies of May's works. They were among the top 10 of the all-time fiction bestseller list. He wrote more than 25 novels, none of them very good, by a young age. In every book, the hero is always a strong, daring man with a self-proclaimed wisdom and judgment beyond his years, a horseman, a crack shot. May himself was a pathological liar. He said he visited the United States, but he hadn't. He read history, not history books, but cowboy books of the American Indians and the American West, and he loved them. Hitler once told Scorzeni, when they talked about May lying about being in America, he said, that doesn't matter. Scorzeni told Hitler Dante was never in hell either, and he could write about hell. So May could write in Germany for Adolf Hitler these stories of the Western, and Hitler had an actor, Louis Trenker, who was one of his favorite actors, who was fascinated with cowboys and Indians and played that part to the hilt. A lot of people are not aware of Hitler's fascination for the American westward movement, and in this book on The Eagle's Nest, he described May's protagonists loved to slaughter members of tribes of redskins, and Adolf Hitler perceived this as an inferior species, that they were grasping, they were outcasts, and there was this proclamation of the superior over the inferior. And the word misfit was used, and in the Wild West of May's books, he liked the word misfit and their tortured existence, and Hitler later took over the word misfit, and misfits became irritating to him. He took gypsies, and he called them inferior and a burden to the Third Reich, and he began to separate them. He liked the idea of the extinction of American Indians, and one of the things he could defend himself about if he was attacked was, look what you did to the American Indians with your westward movement. He had a sense of what happened in America, so he had his own protection in case he was charged with doing something that we hadn't taught him to do. Hitler began first, before he got the Jews, to exterminate about 30,000 gypsies. He called them misfits, those gypsies, and then he went to the midgets and exterminated them. He had a man in Germany, Arthur Nieb, a Nazi, who had worked with J. Edgar Hoover, who helped get the gypsies and kill them. In this book, it said one of the men that was out getting the gypsies for Adolf Hitler, 2/3 of them in pre-Anschluss Germany, that were living a Bohemian style. The man in charge of getting them out of Germany was none other than Arthur Nebe, N-E-B-E, the same Nazi who corresponded with J. Edgar Hoover in a friendly manner. They exchanged information from the Gestapo headquarters October 1939 and were corresponding with each other. Mr. Nebe set up camps for the Berlin gypsies. He had a special place. He ordered them transported out of Germany starting October 20th, 1939. That was right after the beginning of the invasion of Poland. Some were taken to Jewish ghettos. Others were killed on the spot. They were to annihilate all the gypsy misfits and murder them, similar to the orders of the Obersalzberg cowboy. And he compared it to the cowboy rounding up the gypsies. And then, as I say, he went on to the Wild West. He liked stories of the wolf of the Wild West. Hitler liked those. He compared the wolf who gave no mercy to the victims. And he began to identify the men at Dachau with the wolves. And then he imported mosquitoes to give prisoners insect bites, and he would give them malaria and call them misfits, and they would die without medication. Or if they didn't die from that, they were amputated and cut up and then gassed later. He had punishments at Dachau that he took from Western terms. He used places, he called it the stake, taken from American literature, cowboy and Indian literature, and he'd have posts set up because he believed in the cowboy and Indian idea. As I say, this is from a book, The Eagle's Nest, on Adolf Hitler's love of the Western stories of cowboy and Indian. He had victims stretched on the trestle. That was part of our culture. The upper part of the body was horizontal and the legs dangled at the side. He liked that, and he would whip people with strokes, 100 strokes, and they'd be screaming and counting their strokes. And as I say, he would start taking people 27 inches tall. He began with misfit dwarfs. He had that little dwarf that was on the lap of J.P. Morgan, the financier, and taken off and killed because he was against Wall Street. He said she was a dwarf, a tool of Wall Street, and she was shipped to Auschwitz and gassed, along with 10,000 other dwarfs, Jews, dwarfs, gypsies, and so forth. But he used Western terminology, and in fact, Adolf Hitler built a museum for Mays. He built a wax museum, the Karl May Museum near Dresden, that he established because he was so fond of the idea. May read Fenimore Cooper, The Last of the Mohicans, and wrote a book, The Ride Through the Desert, and Hitler reread these novels over and over again. He reversed the swastika of the Indians, and many people think that Hitler's love of the swastika goes back to ancient times, earlier than the Thule Society, and this book on the Eagle's Nest explains part of his interest in the swastika because of the Western craze. So the movie industry was very important in Nazi Germany for propaganda. It was used brilliantly, and the use of the cinema there was transported to the United States, and cinema was used, the cowboy and Indian, the go-get-em, the good guy, the bad guy, the simplistic solutions. Ronald Reagan was wearing his cowboy hat. He adored John Wayne, the Western movement, and this was very much part of the very conservative ideology of the milieu in Hollywood, the movies that we still see on television, and the propaganda machine. And it was this kind of image created out of that milieu that made Ronald Reagan so lovable in 1966 that people were willing to go out and vote for him. 1 million uncommitted Democrats were the ones that pushed Reagan over the hilt and made him governor, not the Republicans even, but those people that weren't really sure what they wanted or knew what they wanted. But the Western image has played an important subconscious level in our society that Hitler understood and that Reagan was a part of in the Hollywood scene with the actors that were doing these Western scenes. And this is a point, as I say, that many people may not be aware of. The use of the motion picture industry that bragged about the fact that it was able, along with General Electric, a huge corporation, to take a man who never had been in politics in his life and make him the governor of a state from 1966 to 1974, when the country was exploding after the death of John Kennedy and would soon witness major assassinations after that time. Half hour's up now. If you're used to these programs, I'm going to turn the the tape over, and then I'll be back with you in a few minutes. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is side 2 of the tape, August 31st, Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. Continuing on our discussion of Ronald Reagan as governor of California, so you know what to anticipate when he becomes, or if he becomes, president of the United States. One of the most important ways of controlling political opponents, or getting rid of obstacles if you want to control the world or have power in the world, is through the use of medicine and drugs and chemicals. Weapons and silencers and hand grenades and tanks and rockets and missiles and satellites aren't the only way to control people, and a very necessary ingredient through this world of criminal spy activity and torture, the instrumentation of the use of instruments, blunt objects to kill people and so forth. There is another way to handle people, and that's to control their minds, and there are many ways to control their minds. But in California, Ronald Reagan was very much part of the Central Intelligence Agency, Pentagon, Defense Department plans for mass experimentation on minds in California. He wasn't a silent partner. There have been many books on the MK Ultra program and the mind control program, and the intent planned in Washington in mind control for the people in the United States and medical experimentation that was distributed among the prisons and hospitals around the country. But a bulk of the research, some of the most insidious and the most dangerous, came out of California again, from Stanford Research, their mind control department, and also UCLA, where Jolly West, the psychiatrist who had testified at Jack Ruby's trial, was linked to the Kennedy assassination, the cover-up of the Kennedy assassination, came out from Oklahoma then to head the institute at UCLA that was to begin to continue. They had been doing some experimentations up to that time, but they would incorporate the federal government into an organization, an institution that Ronald Reagan launched. And from the congressional hearings, the Senate hearings on the Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights, this is individual rights and federal role in behavior modification, published in November of 1974, that's just about at the end of Reagan's administration. I want to read just a few pages that I have had through the years on the radio tapes before, but many of you are not familiar with these and the role of Ronald Reagan. In these hearings that Sam Ervin conducted, I'm quoting from these hearings, they said, in his January 1973 State of the State message, Governor Reagan announced the formation of the Center for the Reduction of Life-Threatening Behavior. Several proposals were drafted, and they named the center for the study of they called it the Center for the Study of Violent Behavior. The project was to begin at UCLA, the University of California, directed by Dr. Stubblebine, and also considered by the Senate Health and Welfare Committee in California. The Criminal Department, the Health and Welfare, Dr. Stubblebine, and the federal government were involved. They said that violence is a major concern in our society. This was in 1973. We had seen the murder of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers. We don't have to run them all down. But violence, they said, was a concern in our society. In 1968, the California officials had secretly amalgamized, I can't pronounce this properly, they had done lobotomies on 3 prisoners, paying scant regard to their legal and ethical issues. This is testimony before the Senate hearings opposing the UCLA school. They did lobotomies on them. Their symptoms returned. One man was suffering. He had additional loss of memory. There were other effects of brain destruction. They did mind-crippling psychosurgery that had been established in 1971. This was in the middle of Reagan's administration. Secret documents came to the attention of the Department of Corrections and the University of California that they had been doing. These documents were released from these organizations, from various persons who found out that they were doing lobotomies and psychosurgery in the institutions long before the proposed center took place. They were using chemical castration, psychosurgery, testing experimental drugs on involuntarily incarcerated individuals, and there was no limit to their activity. There was a plea before Sam Ervin's committee that said in an age of rapidly advancing technology, when new methods of scientific control of mind and behavior are a reality, and a cry for law and order at any cost, we have to preserve human dignity and principles of liberty and freedom. And they brought up the subject that the possibility of political manipulation could take place in these mind control programs that they were using. They went on with discussions of doctors Vernon Mark, William Sweet, and Frank Ervin, who after the Detroit riots in Massachusetts were opening brains and doing brain operations that were not successful, and asked why did Ervin come from Massachusetts to UCLA from Boston? What was he doing in California? And they questioned the $1 million that was given to the UCLA by Health Welfare Administration, the LEAA, federal funding, and so forth. There was a plea to stop the psychosurgery, and they referred to a Santa Monica psychosurgeon who offered to do brain operations on prisoners, Dr. Ralph Schwitz, Schwitzgebel, Schwitz-Witzgebel. I can't pronounce it, but I'll print it on the sheets if you want it. A colleague of Dr. Sweet and Dr. Schwitz-Bagel. He has a brother at Claremont, California, and they did books along with Dr. Delgado on electronic control of the mind and behavior, suggested brain implants, radio implants to monitor emotions and behavior and to control human behavior. These people were working with UCLA, with the CIA, and the federal government, and there was a plea to stop the castrations, the surgical implants, the alteration of the brains, and in summary they said this is a laboratory of the Department of Corrections, the UCLA, and it is a dangerous place for mind-destroying intervention in the brain, and they asked that these things be stopped. Because of Watergate and the exposés of the government in mind control, the UCLA Center, at least on the surface, was stopped, and I believe that in 1973, when that was stopped, that was the year that a group of people, 11 people and Jim Jones, went down to Jonestown with money from the Barclay Bank and Tim Stone from Stanford Law School, and there were people from Stanford Research behind the Jones operation, lawyers and doctors, supplying drugs and mind control experimental drugs that were later identified as CIA-type drugs, and then the mind control experiments could begin down in Jonestown. Dr. Peter Breggin, he lives in Washington, wrote an article in 1979 on the psychiatric Holocaust, and one of my favorite listeners, subscribers to the tape, sent me this article. It was in Penthouse this last January. Dr. Peter Breggin is, again, one of the most important patriots in this fight for individual freedom. In my list of bibliography, I have a list of books or important articles to read on how these repressions came down historically, and I have Peter Breggin's name here and address, the Center for the Study of Psychiatry, and he goes to the fact that his article and his research goes into the information that it was the psychiatrists that were responsible for mass sterilization and mass murders in Germany, that Hitler hadn't even conceived of extermination or death camps until the psychiatrists began to do the experimentation and the killing. And they systematically took people in the psychiatric hospitals for experiments and for testing and used them as guinea pigs and murdered them. And it was so successful that Adolf Hitler could take the advice of the psychiatrists and apply it to the murdering of other people in the concentration camps, going into the many millions. And Peter Breggin compares Germany's Sterilization Act to California, where they systematically sterilized 15,000 psychiatric inmates, and it became the world's chief experimental area for eugenics. See, California is where the sperm banks are down in San Diego. California is where the cloning is going on and the DNA experiments. There are other hospitals in the East doing these things, but California is the hub of these activities. And when you read what is coming out of California and what is going on here, you realize that men like Ronald Reagan, as when he's the governor or the president, not only can look aside, but be very much a part of those activities and pretend they're not happening. What a PR job that is, to pretend these things are not happening. An interesting aspect of Ronald Reagan's career is a man from Hoover Institute, Richard Allen, who is working with him as his chief foreign advisor, another California character from the Hoover Institute. At the time of the Watergate scandals in 1976, a man from Grumman International, the aircraft factory, said that Allen wanted a $1 million bribe contribution in 1971 for Nixon's re-election, and in exchange Grumman would get aircraft sold to Japan. That Allen said, "We can interest the White House to sell aircraft to Japan." You know how Jimmy Carter was twisting the wrist of the Japanese officials to buy more weapons and arm against China. And the truth is that then they get contracts for their favorite people who have put them in office and given them money for their campaigns. This same Allen is suggested to be head of Ronald Reagan's National Security Council if Reagan is president. Allen was on a salary from the notorious Robert Vesco in 1972 as a consultant to Robert Vesco, and he's part of a White House team that covered up the ITT case along with William Casey of Ronald Reagan's inner team right now. Allen was called by Haldeman to stop the Pentagon paper leaks and head the Plumbers Group, which he turned down, but he went on to other activities with, as I said, under the pay of Robert Vesco during the Watergate calamities. He originally claimed he had a degree, a PhD from Munich, Germany. He was a fraud. He didn't have a PhD at all, and when they found out that he lied about his credentials, he said that he wrote a thesis, but it was dropped, and he thought that the Marxists were responsible. He's a man who is against reforms of the intelligence agencies, and as I say, he is suggested to be head of the National Security Council in case Ronald Reagan becomes president. At the time of Watergate, the Watergate arrest took place in June of 1972, and 1 month later, Robert Vesco was in Italy with the top mafia bosses dividing up the world narcotics traffic. 1 month after the arrest at Watergate of Richard Nixon and that team. There's a book called Vesco, The Infernal Money-Making Machine, and it goes into the relationship of not Billy Carter, Robert Vesco, with Richard Nixon's brother Edward, and going to Las Vegas, where they had inroads with the gambling market and the Howard Hughes people. Hughes was behind the loans to Richard Nixon's brother, and the Hughes links to narcotics traffic, the mob, were always fairly well known, and Vesco was traveling around with Richard Nixon's brother after returning from Rome after the Watergate affair. Incidentally, Vesco was not only paying Mr. Richard Allen a salary at the time of Watergate, but at the time, shortly after the Watergate arrest, Mitchell Warbell, the famous man from Georgia who supplies the silencers and weapons and the training teams for military coups and so forth, had been apprehended on an arms deal. His company, Defense Services Company, and a man named Stuart Graydon that worked for Robert Vesco and Mitchell Warbell. These men were under indictment, and the lawyer for Defense Services Company was William Ollenhausen, the partner of Bernard Fensterwald. Fensterwald allegedly was trying to find out who killed John Kennedy. He was a CIA plant who represented James McCord at the same time of the Watergate arrest. Bernard Fensterwald was representing McCord, and his partner was representing Mitchell Warbell and associates of Vesco, Robert Vesco. And Vesco was paying money to Richard Allen, who's now the chief foreign advisor for Ronald Reagan. So if you worry about Billy Carter and Jimmy Carter and the Vesco connections, I mentioned several weeks ago the Reagan-Vesco connections with Richard Allen and Mitchell Warbell and the assassination teams goes deep into the Hughes organization and the murder of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, with the silencers from Georgia and the training teams and the anti-Castro Cubans and the organized crime that were out to get the Kennedy brothers because Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, was investigating these creeps And with the two Kennedys gone, Ted Kennedy remained silent. Vesco still floats around wheeling and dealing with gun merchants and weapons sales and the international market. His market is death and weapons and assassination teams, and no one can touch him because he plays both sides and floats around. But he's more linked to the Reagan administration and to what would be the National Security Advisor than he's even linked to Billy Carter or Jimmy Carter. Now, I mentioned last week about Ronald Reagan and education. In 1966, when Pat Brown was governor, when he was defeated by Ronald Reagan, state and California, the college enrollment had doubled. This is a fact. And according to a book on California education, no qualified applicant had ever been turned away. The campus was exploding. There was a master plan for higher education, and it was the goal of the head of the University of California, Clark Kerr, to keep everyone who was capable of having a college education in college, that it would not cost money for them to get this education. The state of California would give it to them, and we would have an educated society. Mr. Kerr was the head of the University of California for 22 years, and as soon as Ronald Reagan became governor, Kerr was fired that day, out. January 67, no notice. Kerr, who was the major force behind the University of California Master Plan for Education, was working hard for higher education for the masses, was removed immediately after the elections in January 1967. Reagan took office January the 2nd, and immediately that week, Kerr was out, and along supporting his firing was Mr. Haldeman and Alan Grant, the president of the Board of Agriculture, members of the Board of Regents who opposed Kerr. It was a tragic day for the people in California who could not afford education and are suffering today because their families will never get that kind of education. Now, when Ronald Reagan was running for governor of California, he was campaigning to break the University of California, but not only was he doing that, but Claude Kirk in Florida, thousands of miles away from California, ran a campaign to break the University of California. Kirk was the first Republican in 94 years to win an election in Florida in 1966. The same year that Claude Kirk went as governor in Florida, Ronald Reagan was governor in California, and Kirk was about to marry a German woman from Brazil and take on a new marriage, just as Reagan had changed wives from Jane and took on Nancy. Kirk had changed wives and was marrying a German woman from Brazil. In 1966, they ran their election on breaking the University of California, and by January the 13th, Kirk and Reagan had lunch in California. In 1967 this was, and it was that next day that Kerr was fired, no pay, no notice, and so forth. So that an important part of the fascism that Reinhard Gehlen wanted in Germany, that Hitler wanted, that the controllers want is as few of the middle class as necessary. Some people, experts in certain trades, but a handful of wealthy and a lot of slave labor, and the educated middle class are expendable. That sounds pretty gross, but that has been their goal. And if you read books and statistics on why Johnny can't read and why they can't get an education, if you don't think there was a conspiracy behind it, get out your articles or newspapers, and I'll give you a bibliography of Clark Kerr and the campaign promises of Claude Kirk in Florida and Ronald Reagan, and where they met and when, and how Kerr was fired and what it did to the state of California. But Claude Kirk didn't just ruin, along with Ronald Reagan, California. As soon as he became governor, he had his own police force. He hired Mr. Wackenhut, and there was an article in the Los Angeles Times, February 1967, the next month, concern mounts over secret police force, the Florida governor's so-called war on crime. He admitted it wasn't to get organized crime in Florida, it was to get labor leaders, organized labor, that the Wackenhut Corporation was hired by Kirk in Florida. The Los Angeles Times said Governor Reagan, who discussed the crime problem of labor with Kirk, had no plans himself to hire a private police force in California, but he would set up an anti-crime bill with the state legislature later. Claude Kirk, the same man that put Reagan into power, the same people that put him into power, put Reagan into power, and they have a common bond between Florida and California. Kirk hired George Wackenhut, an ex-FBI agent, a self-made millionaire with a private force, extensive operations in California. Wackenhut was a right-winger, vehemently opposed to organized labor. He has expressed the opinion that the country would be better off if all union organizers and a godly number of union members would drop dead. This is an ex-FBI member, and he had people beaten by union people beaten by the skull, and he gave orders that you can break your clubs over some skulls, end quote. He was violently anti-union. He had fears of socialism. He referred to the United States as rapidly getting socialist, and gave orders that violence was okay with his people. He has a board of directors a mile long of members of the Birch Society, people from California, from the East, retired military on the board of directors. The Wackenhut Corporation now guards the airports. I believe that the early and middle and late hijackings were an excuse to get control so that no matter who wants to escape this country or leave at a time of turmoil, can be stopped by a Wackenhut guard. When you go through the gates, when you check in your luggage, it is the Wackenhut people who check you out. They are hired at the airports, and we don't have civilian guards at the military bases, of course, and they're not regular Army people taking turns doing guard duty out here at Fort Ord. At least it used to be that way. Wackenhut Corporation guards the military bases. Who goes in, who goes out, who leaves the airports, who comes in. So the avenues of communication of coming and going are limited, and the Wackenhut Corporation had its tentacles across this nation, particularly from Florida to California. In this article in the New York Times describing Wackenhut right after their inauguration, it said in 12 years he built the firm from $89,000 a year operation to a $23 million firm. This was in 1967. 5,000 employees, 28 offices in the United States, Puerto Rico, Venezuela, and Colombia, and their largest customers are the Atomic Energy Commission, Lockheed Aircraft, Mack Trucks, NASA, National Airlines, Republic Aviation, Fairchild, Shell Oil, Tidewater Oil, TWA, Westinghouse Electric Corporation, Astro Nuclear Laboratories. In the cloak and dagger business, Wackenhut bragged that his investigators were able to get out Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. from New York. That was a black man in Congress long before many of you remember, who was singled out, not doing any crime different than what the white hierarchy were doing in Congress, but he was a freak, a phenomena, a black man in Congress, and they fixed him up with some women and got him off on, I forget even the details myself. I have filed on this poor man, this Adam Clayton Powell, the representative from New York, but Wackenhut prided himself in being able to extricate him from Congress. This is a man violently against labor, closely linked to Ronald Reagan, working for Claude Kirk, the Wackenhut Corporation. They have put their roots into various cities across the United States. Wackenhut, of course, how could it be otherwise, was a native of Philadelphia, and I've done many hours and radio tapes on the Philadelphia connections to the assassinations. Samuel Cummings, the arms merchant in London from Philadelphia, the Grace Kelly Monte Carlo connections to Onassis, and the monarchy in waiting that centered around Monte Carlo and France and England for so long, waiting to be restored to their thrones when the Russian Revolution is erased and there is no more Soviet Union. The Wackenhut people, his home roots are in Philadelphia, so was George de Mohrenschildt, and a long list of people involved in the assassination of John Kennedy. Wackenhut was successful to incorporate his organization with Claude Kirk, and Claude Kirk linked to Ronald Reagan. And this detective firm is so suspect that many articles have been written questioning even the danger of these private police forces. Fred Cook wrote an article in Nation magazine back in 1967, Governor Kirk's Private Eyes, and talked about the guards and the Wackenhut Corporation. And of course, it's important to go back again to the mutual campaign that they were running, Ronald Reagan and Wackenhut and Claude Kirk in Florida, to break the University of California and the education that we needed here. Well, California was filled with violences while Reagan was president, and the ones I list for you are areas that I have researched. I have many files on them. We lived through them out here in California. He was elected November the 8th, 1966. He was inaugurated January the 2nd in 67. As I say, he fired the president of the university in Berkeley after 22 years there, and Operation Chaos was going full swing. This was the place of the Manson family. Charles Watson was brought out from Texas. He was working with people linked to the Howard Hughes organization. The Spahn Ranch that was used by Manson was where Howard Hughes filmed The Outlaw. It bordered the Krupp property, the German multinationals, this ranch, and this neo-Nazi group of bikers was used. They employed as a front man a guitar-playing man, somewhat of a musical genius with bad breaks and heavily controlled by LSD and drugs to simulate a combination of a hippie and a Rasputin, and to scare the parents whose children had left the great flower power scene and bring down violence. There were links of Manson to Sheriff Peter Pitches, the LAPD, and the Goon Squad, the Operation Chaos that was taking place, and of course the La Bianca murders that happened the next night. There were the massive Santa Cruz violences that were linked to this chain of narcotics, counterintelligence of Evel Younger, Ed Davis, criminal conspiracy section, those men of Edmund Kemper, Herbert Mullen, and John Frazier, and the mass murders, again, left allegedly as hippies, reading tarot cards, etc. They were not that type. Several of them were taken to Honolulu, to Army bases, in the company of older women, and were under mind control. There was the terrible San Quentin shootout where George Jackson was murdered, and Louis Tackwood from the LAPD claimed that the weapon that killed George Jackson was brought in from the LAPD, that it was purposely done to get rid of this black leader of the Black Panthers, the political movement. There was the killings, the Soledad trial, the killing of the guards out in Soledad, California, the creation of the SLA by the Central Intelligence Agency with Colson Westbrook and agents from Indiana that came to California. I only have 2 minutes and 34 instances of violence and that came down when Reagan was governor here. The breaking up of anti-war demonstrations with agent provocateurs, the Isla Vista riots in the summer of 1967, when Reagan had been governor 1 year in this country. There were 16,000 arrests across the country for riots and only 2,000 convictions. And that wasn't because the government was generous. It was because so many of them came forward and admitted they were federal agents and agent provocateurs that instigated the riots. 75 people, there were 75 riots in 67, 83 people killed, 16,000 arrested, and only 2,000 convictions. And the provocateurs surfaced and told about their part in creating this violence. California was ripe with violence. I didn't do enough on Ronald Reagan. Maybe next week I'll do just 1 more hour on Ronald Reagan to sum up his experiences as governor and his links to some of these assassination teams, and not leave these ends dangling, or do an update for you on the news and a little more on Reagan, because this passive Mr. Good Guy is just too sickening. As I say, I know personally people that lived through traumas and pain and murder in this state and counterintelligence, and we still don't know where those files are. We know where they went, but we know they weren't destroyed. I will do more on Ronald Reagan for you. The East Coast was so concerned with Nelson Rockefeller and the power of the Rockefellers that it was very hard to convince them of what was going on in California. But I think the sum total of how California will affect the nation and has affected the nation will begin to be added up soon. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. I'll be back with you next week, part 3 of Ronald Reagan. You take care, and we'll get together at that time.